I had something I wanted to bring up. Just went through some credit hour courses from testing places and talked about non-chemical uses. I know Gorse makes a very large seed bank, and I'm sure everybody knows that you could actually basically kill off everything that's in the soil by covering up with a few layers of plastic and letting it get cooked, get hot enough. And I was wondering if that would be a possible use on a larger scale. You can get large sheets of plastic, they cover them up all the time, but it's black plastic for dump sites and stuff.
They did that up at Baker Beach, Glenn. What became of that?
Boy, you know, a lot of places I've seen, the duff is so deep that you just can't get heat penetration down. I mean, at Whiskey Run, when I was doing seed samples, I mean, we had a foot of duff.
Yeah.
It's just quite remarkable. The only way I can see covering working is that if you cover, open it up, and what you've done is done some reduction in the seed coat resistance. Seedlings come up and recover, and that's something that Walama Restoration has developed in the Eugene area, where they discovered that coverings work so much better when you pull it back after 3 or 4 months, let that flush of seedlings come up, and then recover it for another year perhaps. So
another, I haven't tried it with Gorse, but another thing, similar concept, is to get thick clear plastic. So you cut it down, and if you can, try to rake out some of the duff, but then cover with clear, the clear plastic. It doesn't get quite as hot, and so it might be an issue in the coast because we have so many sunny days out here. But you know, you can still get a really good steam effect because you still, you know, it's still plastic, so you're essentially doing a little greenhouse, and especially if you get really good coverage of the plastic of the soil, so you use, you know, either trench it in a little bit around the sides or use a ton of staples around that, and then you'll kill off what's up there, but then you also stimulate the germination because it doesn't get quite as hot, and so then you'll get some flushes of germination, and so clear plastic in some cases can have some of the same effects, but I haven't tried it, and you know, it seems like one of the issues here is the brittleness of the plastic with the woodies that you're trying to cover, because the plastic can get even more brittle with more sun exposure.
There was a study in Australia. I've been doing a lot of research in Australia, and they put out an article controlling gorse seed banks, and they did all kinds of methods of trying to control the seed bank, and one of them was the solarization. And basically the area was covered with clear polythene sheeting. Temperatures were data logged, 2 centimeters deep and 6 centimeters deep under the sheet, and then excavated 4 months later, and the seed tested for viability. And then they did all kinds of other testing on the seed banks, microwave radiation, someone mentioned that to me earlier, temperature, hydrocarbons, scarification, smoked water for whether or not burning affects the seed bank, and this is the most depressing article I have come upon. And the conclusion starts out, gorse seed is proving to be very resilient to a range of control techniques. And as far as, let me see what it says about the solarization, it's not very positive. Basically, one of the things that they recommend is, here it is, solarization would appear to be less likely for a successful technique. Solarization and microwave is one of the less, you know, all the data's here. They believe actually that burial of the seed is one of the most useful methods because it can only germinate under, I think it's 20 centimeters. If it's buried under 20 centimeters, it cannot germinate. didn't say
Oh,
that.
no, I mean, did someone say about
Well,
evolution of it?
you know,
or
there's
change?
so much we can do and predict. We have to move forward. You know, I don't want to get bogged down on what can happen with evolution, or we're gonna just all run out of here and go home. So,
Do you know if anyone's tested saltwater?
I think so. Does anybody know about that? Saltwater has proven effective on some things, but then it's also very corrosive and really bad for other things that we're trying to do. Very toxic on a lot of the.
I think Gorse is 70%.
Given our beaches, I don't think it's probably very likely it's salt spray.
Well, some of the handouts that we have available here talk about combining different techniques of controlling gorse. And of course, that works for a lot of different species. So multiple treatments in combination in series that are designed to address different parts of an invader or its life cycle, whatever. It seems like that's going to be an important thing for us to consider. What are some different sequences or different combinations that we think might be workable, have been shown to work, or we might want to try?
I think that's definitely the case. I think there's a lot of ways to kill gorse. I think using multiple techniques is the way to go. I think there's not any one way to do it. There's certainly the right way for you and for your area. And I think the thing that we have to figure out is where do we go next? How do we keep it out? And how do we move forward to strategize? Go ahead.
Sherry, I just thought we might ask Glenn Miller to give a report, kind of what the Forest Service did up there at Baker Beach, because that was the most impressive gorse project that I've seen anywhere in Oregon, and it was fairly large scale, and he has more experience with what they did up there than I do, so.
What do you think, Glenn?
All right.
All right.
Go stand up.
Come on, I want to hear you.
See, the New Zealanders are actually the kings of gorse control because 7% of their land mass is gorse. Up and down, it's just unbelievable. But their technique for actually converting mountain ranges into productive forest land was where you could, they would run the whole thing over with a bulldozer, not with the blade down, they just would crush it. And then they may spray beforehand or they may not, but once they had it down, they could then burn it and get a hot ground burn. And that was important, otherwise you get a wildfire. But they would burn entire mountain ranges and after crushing it. And then they were in a program after that of tree planting and following up with backpack applications that you have to continue for a long time. But they were using KMX pine coming back in. That's a very fast growing pine. So pretty fascinating stuff they've done. But we did a lot of gorse spraying. The Baker Beach project, they crushed it and burned the whole thing. A spectacular burn. They got a really phenomenal amount of control with that, burned a lot of the seed out of the ground. And then since then, they've been going in with backpack crews, whether their own people or us or private contractors, and they backpack spray out all these little plants that come up. So if you get up on the ridge above the Lily Lake area north of Florence, it's really remarkable how many acres they've got under control. And so it's a very fun project to be a part of over the years. And one of the things I never thought of at the time, but we would take our ATVs and things up into the dunal areas and did a lot of spraying. We put a lot of chemical down. And, you know, in normal soils, a lot of times herbicides will wind up with the soils. And I never thought about the gallons and gallons and gallons of herbicide we applied. When they hit that sand and they wash through, there's nothing going to break that down or hold on to it. So if you've got water tables, high water tables, chances are if you're using some some of the more persistent compounds, chances are they're going to stay there, or they're going to migrate. So I'm getting a little more ecological as I get older. So, but it's true. And, you know, sometimes we put spray operations several thousand gallons. And I never thought that, you know, this is not all going away. So you just have to think about that. You get back inland on the regular soils, it's not such a factor. I noticed on the list here that people had a bunch of chemicals they were trying. Has anybody tried Milestone yet?
I had one contractor use a little bit last year, and it seemed like it was really effective. He only did it a handful of plants, but
It's a new compound that has an extremely a lot of activity at a very low rate. So you're not applying very much product, so that might be effective. Stump treatments, I think, is really great. Did that up on Fort Stevens State Park years ago when they had their infestations. Most infestations just almost eradicated. So, another thing to mention, the New Zealanders and Australians did a lot of studies on soil seed bank survivability. And yeah, the seeds can theoretically survive many, many years. And what they're finding out is in healthy soil environments, the organisms that are in the soils use these different seeds as a seed source, as a food source. And what they discovered is after 10 years, the majority of the seeds were gone from the soil profiles. So that's something to keep in mind if you just prevent seed production.
The viability drops severely after 10 years.
Well,
right.
the seeds are just gone.
Seeds themselves are eaten.
The seeds themselves. And I actually was doing some work on Scotch broom on the Willamette National Forest. I took soil seed samples many years ago near Oak Ridge, and went back to the site about 15 years later and sampled the same site. There were no Scotch broom seeds, and this was a big Scotch broom patch. And this was after reading this article from, I think it was Australia, and realized it's true. These organisms will remove most of those seeds from your soil profile. Whether they do that on a dunal condition, I don't know, because it may not have the complexity of the soil organisms. This is something to keep in mind. Yes?
Did you say that you sprayed before crushing on your restoration site, or did you just crush and then burn?
The Forest Service did the initial crushing, burning, and then retreatment with backpack sprayers. What we were sent in to do was, because we have the equipment to get, we're crazy too, take our ATVs and Polarises and get deep into the dunal areas. We were doing the retreatment of bushes that resprouts, things like that.
And what percentage did you have of that? I mean, could you tell? I mean,
But
do they have data on that?
Percentage of things that actually survived a good burn.
Yeah, I mean, after you did your restoration site, or they did the restoration site, and you had X amount of acres of gorse, what were the numbers after that treatment that were popping up? Was it?
Nobody took any numbers as far as I know. And it varied. Here, a lot of it was in the wetland areas. Gorse survived very nicely in those wetland areas. And so our treatments during the dry time of the year. So it was a significant reduction.
Okay,
Those pictures I showed where all the seedlings were coming, that's Baker Beach. That's where that was done. So there was a huge flush of seedlings. They went out and treated all those, knocked those down, and then just kept going. But each year, the amount that they treat and spray was less and less. They still had to cover all the land, and then they just have to go back and hit all the stragglers. But the natural restoration in those areas was actually quite amazing. The area, you would never guess what it looked like before. It looked a lot like Whiskey Run.
Just what kind of chemical mix are you using for just spraying and also your stump spraying? Is it the same?
Well, being on Forest Service ground and in those sandy soils, we were using glyphosate. It was later in the year. Our efficacy
just
glyphosate, and our efficacy was lower. Many of the big plants would take probably 4 years of treatments to really totally kill. Translocation in gorse is the most frustrating thing on the planet. It just doesn't translocate stuff. So it was a matter of starving the plant down. We treat a big bush, it burned down a ways, and then you see the trunk resprouting. So you come back next year, you treat the trunk. It looked all dead, and then you come back, and here's a sprig coming off the side that somehow made it.
We've sprayed whole bushes, and like just a chunk will stay alive.
One single branch will survive, and you can wipe out the entire rest of the plant, and it will still make it. And the only reason I think you can do that is the translocation is not doing very well. Because otherwise, you would kill the roots, you would kill the rest of the stem. So, really, just a superior plant.
When you do stump spraying or painting, what are you using?
For that, simply Garland 3 works very nicely. Yeah.
We've been using 4 even spray.
Yeah. I don't use as much. In fact, I don't use the 4 very much. Even though it's more effective, it's just an oil-based product. And on a warm day, it really stinks. You can get yourself sick. So I just choose not to use it very much. But it is better because they're killing it.
One more question. What was the cost of the restoration site?
Oh,
in May?
I don't have. I
No,
don't know.
okay.
Well, we actually did record the cost
Right.
in the area that we did. The Forest Service ranger looked at it and we can't do that for this price, and he was very pleased.
Okay.
But it's all about having equipment.
I don't know how you guys are doing it down here, but up where we're at, we actually do gorse surveys throughout the county, and we find out the parcels or lots that have the gorse, which is substantial. And anyway, we send a letter to the property owner threatening that it's basically a Class B designate that has to be taken care of. So we say that if you don't get rid of it, we're going to fine you. And then when they contact us again, then we basically charge them $3 per gallon next to go and take care of it. So it's a small cost to the landowner. That's the best. That's the only way we can really effectively financially take care of it.
Well, if you can, early detection is so important. It's really nice that Bonneville Power Administration flags their lines every year, and they let us go on their big bird and flag lines whenever we ask them to for free. And you'll see patches of gorse hidden back in the Coast Range, and we take GPS readings, and someone goes back in there and takes those plants out. But if left alone, you have a new infestation. So, equipment that's used for right-of-way maintenance, especially power lines, really shatters seeds and plant material, and it gets on the mower decks, and they get loaded up, transported from eastern Oregon to western Oregon. We had a gorse site up at Cougar Reservoir up in the Cascades. Where was that from? That's a Bonneville Power site, and the equipment had came from Bandon area, and there's a gorse patch there. So it's now eradicated. So, early detection, getting on those plants when they're small, I just really, that's so important.
My name is Brian Kranick. I'm basically a concerned citizen, and with all of you here, I'd like input and help facilitating a county, well, I would start in the county. I'd like Coos County to be an example, but an inmate work program that I would like to facilitate. And so I'm looking for help or suggestions or input, any kind of support for an inmate work program, pulling gorse and getting rid of it, at least for public safety, is access into these big gorse patches is a start, because this whole county could go up in flames easily, quickly, any time of year. And if the fire crews have access to these places, they can at least battle and keep the whole county from going ablaze. So I'd love to talk to any of you and get any kind of support I can for county inmate work crews. And I'm even willing to go and become a deputized reserve sheriff deputy to be able to oversee this operation. So that's what I'm here for, and I'd love to talk to anybody that can help me with that. So.
Buy lots of chainsaws, because that stuff will eat your bars up and eat your chains up.
It's the inmate labor. They're doing it by hand.
Oh. And that's cruel and inhuman punishment. Good deterrent.
Root pullers, and they need a deterrent.
those who don't know me, I'm Andrea Thorpe. I'm at the Institute for Applied Ecology. You mentioned that they're shading in New Zealand, they're planting trees over the gorse. And I was just, this is partially, I'm racking my brain to think about, you know, for us here, one of the issues is, it's like at Baker, where they are getting some great success. The question, and you know, we're developing tools, you know, between what Eric's looking into and thinking about different herbicide combinations and all these other treatment combinations, and being involved myself in some projects where we're looking at these constant, like having to constantly go into an area to create a disturbance. And the issue is, what I'm thinking about here at the gorse in New Zealand, they're planting the trees that will then provide the shade that will help to keep the gorse from reinvading their restoration areas. One of the things that I've been thinking about is what would we do here? You know, as someone who works on endangered dунal plants, I'm not exactly pro planting trees, but if we could plant, but what do we want it to be? Because if we just remove the gorse, then we're just going to get invasion of something, either more gorse or something else that we're then going to want to control. And so I guess I don't have any answer in this question. It's just, this is my thought process. So I'm sorry if I am burdening you with it, but just something for the group too to think about is there something else that we want to come in?
This has been one of my big dilemmas on restoring parklands, and so the field trip today out to Bullard's Beach is our beginning answer to that question. And we're trying to restore the native dунal systems after gorse removal. And so you'll see what we've done with planting a native, the native dune grass as our first competitive plant, and then we're overspraying that, and then we plan to continue planting native competitive species when we get the gorse seed base under control. So that's where we're also headed, but we have lots of questions, we have lots of concerns. We want to see more monitoring, more research. We want to understand better, but that's the direction we want to head.
Well, in areas where they couldn't get heavy equipment on, economically they realized they couldn't control all the gorse, so what they were doing, it was just spectacular to see. They would send guys with chainsaws and they would cut strips up the mountainsides. And they were cutting the strips just wide enough to be able to plug their trees in. And then from then on, the herbicide applications were just to keep those little strip corridors open enough to get the trees up and growing. And if you might look at that philosophy for some of these more inland areas where you just couldn't afford to completely remove the gorse, but if you knew you had a really good canopy of Sitka spruce, you might actually have something more than just a gorse field. If you were going to do that, I would use big potted trees. I wouldn't use little 1-foot seedlings. We're talking expensive trees, but that way you will get that head start that you need. But maybe living with some of the gorse might be the smartest thing to do. At least somehow, to a certain degree, getting some other kind of vegetation growing in there.
So one kind of approach is to think of some alternative desired future states and how one would get to those. So if we don't know what we want it to look like instead of gorse, it's kind of hard to know how to get there. And so in some contexts, establishing a stand of trees might be a desired future state, and that might be a useful tool to get to that state, actually, is planting trees. But for other situations like a dune system, maybe not so much. So depending on the desired future conditions for a particular site, we're going to have different techniques to get there, I think. And so channeling this conversation towards some of these alternative futures so that we can design approaches to meet each of those might be more efficient.
Well, I think in the areas that we're working, identifying achievable desired future conditions is further complicated by Sally's presentation, where we're talking about the stabilization and how different the system is looking. I mean, classical restoration perspective, you look back on historical systems and try and emulate what was there. So I think we have a pretty complicated question ahead of us.
And some of them may be now novel communities that are, we don't have an analog for historically, but we perform some functions, some ecosystem services that are desirable and are better than a Gorse dam.
It's open for interpretation a little bit. I think
And
I
controversy.
have Sherry's position on the north coast, so I don't have as much Gorse, but similar coastal dune ecology concerns, especially with beachgrass and scotch broom and trying to create desired future conditions. So.
Yeah, it seems like one of the issues that we have to, when we think about restoration, instead of looking backwards to what was and what we want to recreate, looking instead what the system is capable of now and what are the ecological functions that we wanted to have. And one of the big ones being continued resistance to invasion once we do that restoration. And so instead of, the history can help inform what we restore, but that's not all. We have to consider what Sally talked about. So, really diving into those, what are the ecological features that we want a restoration site to be, not necessarily we want to restore it to something that really isn't a possible state anymore.
But we also have to take into consideration that what else you folks as scientists and as researchers and stuff can see historically or see as what's desired may not fit within the local geopolitical community issues that we run into. Where we want to go ahead and bring a section of the park back to a certain environment. Unfortunately, the folks who influence around us may only have a 50-year memory of that park, and what they consider that park to look at, isn't what it looked like 100 years ago, which is what we'd really like to go back to. And so then we have to try to sell that concept, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And then as we start to do those restorations, how big do we do in order to ensure survivability of that effort? Because of the cost and the influences of other processes. Eric and I talked earlier about the fact that we can get buy-in now, and 5 to 10 years down the later, we can run into another a changeover in people and in personalities and in commitments, and we can lose a significant amount of funding or processes and lose what we've gained. So we have to really take those bites in bites that we can maintain based upon the culture around us and the economics around us.
So one thing I wanted to just throw out was, with my research looking at Australia and New Zealand, is just to let you know what's been done there, just to give you a vision of what can be done. And this is just their National Gorse Program achievements. They've had gorse in the country since 1800 in Australia, just like us. And in 2003, they developed a strategic plan. They appointed a National Gorse Coordinator. They developed a Gorse Task Force. They developed eradication areas. They developed priority action framework document to help guide investment management. So where do they find the money? They developed a best practice manual, and I put that up here for everyone to look at. It's available on the web. Then they developed a memo of understanding. For 25 years, partners, just like all of us, sign an agreement to remove gorse on their properties. They agree for 25 years to continue to work on that site. Every year, the task force notifies them that it's time to herbicide, or it's time to deal with your seedlings, or it's time to release your biocontrol. So they get these notices. Then they have, they are well aware that there's lots of turnover in agencies, and that program could be compromised. So they've appointed a citizen in the area, a landowner who's invested in that area, and that person is a watchdog who keeps those agencies on their toes, reminding them that they signed this MOU, and they keep that program running. Apparently it's been extremely successful. And so now they've released their second edition, improving their best practice methods. That's the second edition there. In the back is a disc that I printed out, and it's a field manual for surveying and mapping gorse. And now they have nationally outstanding gorse management achiever awards that they give out because they've eradicated it from 7 states. Eradicated. It's a word we don't use here. So that's it's a heck of a commitment they've made, and they're seeing great success. And it's because they have a national commitment, funding-wise, agency-wide, landowner-wise, and it's something that I just thought I would mention here, that it took a group of people like us to pull something like that together. And so, just in case you wanted to learn more about that, I printed their strategic plan and an example of how they went about developing their MOU. So, does anyone want copies of that? And then lunch is ready, getting ready here, and we can talk through lunch, and then our shuttles will be arriving in about a half hour. So.